In today's show, we'll be discussing learning to learn and learning strategies. I will be joined by James Mannion, co-author of Fear is the Mind Killer, and Zoe Enza, co-author of Generative Learning, to discuss key learning strategies and how we can support pupils to be the independent learners we want them to be. It's 6 p.m. and it's the Twilight Show.
Live from Rome, this is the Twilight Show with Freya Odell on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/LSW/TT Radio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TT Radio.
Good evening. How are we all? I hope that you are having a good week. Let us know how your week has been in the chat. The sun is shining here in Rome, and dare I say it, the countdown to the end of the school year has begun. We've been continuing to enjoy our freedom in Italy, and so many of us, my colleagues and I, have been traveling here, there, and everywhere. So we've been to Simonetta, Florence, Venice, Sorrento, Capri, Perugia, you name it. We've been there over the past few weeks and it has been absolutely fantastic. Love to know what the situation is like in the UK at the moment for travel. We are all here in Italy desperate to get back to England for the summer. The majority of the teachers at my school, we've now started our second round of vaccinations, and we're all busy trying to get our vaccine passports sorted in an attempt to get back to the UK. I literally cannot wait. It has been 18 months now since I last saw family and friends. My sister is getting married in September, so I'm desperately hoping to get back to the UK for that. Also desperate for the full English, a decent curry, and a bit of shopping at Next as well. Delighted also this week to see all the conferences starting back up again. Who has their tickets for the conferences that have started to re-advertise? I've got my ticket for the Research Ed National Conference in September. So hopefully I will get to see lots of you there. Now, I can't start today's show without mentioning the E word, Eurovision. Yes! It's coming home. It's coming to Italy. So I am a massive, massive Eurovision fan and honestly could not believe that we won Eurovision this year. Exactly. Italy did it. I have to say my vote actually went to Lithuania, but oh my goodness, am I excited about Eurovision coming to Italy next year. And of course, you are all welcome. I'm also delighted to say that one of our SLT has already suggested that we are going to have, wait for it, a Eurovision day at school as well. I literally could not be more excited. San Marino, was that the one with the famous rapper? I've forgotten his name. San Marino. No, Italy. Well done, Italy. So looking forward. That's it, Flo Rida. So looking forward to Eurovision being in Italy next year. And like I say, you are all invited to join us next year. And finally, we are coming to the end of the tag process. The end of the process is in sight. One absolutely Herculean effort teachers have been putting in over the past few months, honestly, and the pupils, of course. I really do hope that next week you all get a very well-deserved half-term break. Let us know what you're up to in the chat. Let us know what you're going to be doing over half-term. I hope that you're going to be getting lots of rest and relaxation. James is already in the studio, which is fantastic. So I'm going to bring him on when I start the news. It is lovely to be back this week. I had a few technical difficulties last week. It is the way with Italy sometimes. But I've really, really enjoyed so many of the fantastic shows that we have had this week. I really enjoyed listening to Rich Wrigley last night on his show. He was talking about making the move internationally, which is obviously something that I am personally invested in. and it was great to get some insights about working slightly further afield. I also really enjoyed the Late Show with Dan Edwards, the focus on metacognition. I actually did some training today on metacognition. I'm really, really excited to build that into some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. I also regularly tune into Amy's show on a Saturday morning and Sobia's show on a Sunday morning as well. And if that isn't enough to whet your appetite, the wonderful Kate Jones has just the most wonderful lineup of stellar guests. And I think this week she's going to be talking to Alex Quigley. So do stay in touch with that. We have such an amazing range of hosts and such a wonderful range of shows for you to listen to. And if you can't listen live, then you can always listen back via the Teachers Talk Radio website. I am now listening to a show every morning on my way to work on the metro, and I absolutely love it. It gets me in the mood for a day of school. And we are still on the lookout for new presenters. Yesterday, we learned that Tabitha McIntosh will be joining the team. I literally cannot wait to listen to her show on Tuesday mornings. She has such an amazing Twitter presence and a really strong voice within the education community. So excited. But I'm more excited, I have to say, for today's show, for tonight's show. I'm going to be talking to James Mannion in a moment. James is here and I'm going to bring him on in a second, and Zoe Enza later, and we are going to be talking all things learning. So please do get involved via the chat or use the hashtag TT Radio 2021. Tom has said we're streaming the show right now on Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. I don't think I've ever been on so many platforms at once. But before we get started with today's show, before we get chatting to James, let's catch up with the education news from Megan Goods.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Megan Goods.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News. It has been 33 years since the introduction of Section 28 into British law. The discriminatory law came into effect on the 24th of May 1988 and made it illegal for teachers and local councils to educate students about the LGBT community. Section 28 was introduced by Margaret Thatcher following a conference speech in 1987 where she stated, "Children that need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. And all of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life." The amendment was still in place less than 20 years ago, only being revoked in England and Wales in 2003. Academics from Exeter University and the London School of Economics have found that during lockdown, 91% of children aged 9 to 16 had access to a computer, and 90% had good internet connection. However, only 74% of students had a quiet place to study. Parents involved in the study stated that the lack of a suitable place to work was more of a barrier to learning during the time away from school than issues with access to technology. BBC Radio 4 and Teaching Union NASUWT have joined forces to compile a survey on teachers' confidence levels when dealing with incidents of sexual assault. More than half of teachers questioned felt their schools did not have the resources to deal with such incidents. Almost a third of those surveyed also said they had witnessed peer-on-peer sexual harassment or abuse, and almost 1 in 10 said they saw it on a weekly basis. The study concluded that better training and support was needed for staff dealing with the steadily rising number of sexual assault cases in schools. That was your daily education news briefing.
Thank you so much, Megan. And we will hear from Megan again later on in the show. So I'm just waiting for James to ring in. James, if you're there, you are more than welcome to ring in now. I can't wait to get talking to you. So my first guest, hopefully, if we can get the tech sorted, is James Mannion. He is co-author of Fear is the Mind Killer. Originally a science teacher, James also has an MA in person-centered education and a PhD in learning to learn from the University of Cambridge. I am really, really excited to speak to James this evening about his book, especially because his book is a reflection of a 8-year evaluation of the learning skills curriculum. I cannot wait to hear and learn from his experience. James, are you there? Okay, James, do you want to just, it says that I'm connected, but I can't actually see you as, it says that you're blocked. Okay, let's just try that again then. Do you want to just try and ring in again, and we'll give that another go? There's always something technical that we have to work through. So I'm okay. Let's try again. Oh, you've just entered the live studio again. We're hoping to get James with us shortly. Really, really excited. James is just ringing in now. We have it there. There's always something, isn't there? There's always something that then makes you super, super nervous. Okay, so I've got him. James.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, I think you're there. I think we're connected.
We made it.
Yes. Are you there, James?
Amazing. I am here, yes. And my dog, every time I get a new Zoom call or whatever, my dog comes to say hello. So if you can hear some weird noises, that's my dog. He's brought you a present.
Dogs cat the other week with Noreen brought her dog as well, so dogs are always welcome. It's so lovely to have you on the show today, and I'm so excited to talk to you because I've read Fear is the Mind Killer, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and we're working towards at my school in terms of a learning to learn program. I've obviously just given you a very brief introduction. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your career to date.
Yeah, okay. Hello, Freya, and hello, anyone who's listening. So I am so where do I begin? I started as a secondary school teacher, science teacher, and I did that for about 12 years in various schools and held various school leadership positions. And then I got into research really early on in my career. I did a research-based MA and just got the bug for doing research. As it was just by far the best professional development that I had ever had. And so I did that and got really into it. And then at the school that I was then at, we've just been placed in special measures, which is like the naughty step for any international listeners. And we got this new head teacher in, and as well as wanting to make the quick fixes that you need to do to get out of special measures, he wanted to put into place like long-term cultural change at the school, which was all good. And one aspect of that was to create a Year 7 learning to learn curriculum. I didn't really know much about what it was at the time. I applied because I thought it sort of sounded interesting, and I was a bit frustrated with teaching science anyway. But we could talk about that later if you like. And it turned out to be this amazing thing. So because there was a competitive selection process, the team of teachers who was appointed to lead this new initiative, we were all really up for it. Like, we were very enthusiastic. We would go around to each other's houses at night and at weekends and in the holidays, planning and what have you. And so he gave us the whole of Year 7 for 5 lessons a week, and we could do with that time whatever we wanted. He just said, over to you, which was this unbelievable opportunity, really, to do something really different. And I wanted to capture it in the best way possible. And being by now addicted to teacher research, I signed up to do a PhD, which turned out to be an 8-year study. So I followed 4 cohorts of kids from year 7 through to year 11, 1 control cohort and 3 learning to learn cohorts. And we can talk about the results of that study if you like later on. But as a spoiler, it was amazing. Those kids went on to achieve the best set of results that school had ever seen. And then it took me about 3 years to write that up firstly as a PhD and then into a book, which you mentioned earlier, Fear is the Mind Killer, which I co-authored with my amazing colleague, Kate McAllister. And now I work at the Institute of Education as a programs leader in the Centre for Educational Leadership, running programs for groups of school leaders on a range of different topics, which we could talk about as well. And I'm a training provider on the side, and I'm starting to spread this work in learning to learn and also in other areas like implementation science and practitioner inquiry far and wide. And that is probably quite a long introduction, but that's a pretty good potted history.
No, that's fantastic. And it's absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I particularly like about the book and what you're saying is that this isn't just a very short research project. This is something that you have been working on for many, many years.
Yeah, and Kate even longer. Kate started this journey about 15 or 16 years ago now. And she now is in the Dominican Republic. So she spiraled off in a different direction and started taking these practices, first of all, into refugee camps. So a few years ago, when the migrant crisis was really on everybody's mind, you remember in that summer, and not that the migrant crisis has gone away, of course, but it's not in the news so much anymore. So Kate, like many people, found herself feeling quite frustrated and throwing things at the television, but she sort of decided to do something about it. So she crowdfunded some money and bought it turns out you can buy a double-decker bus on eBay. So she did that, and she got it all kitted out with solar panels and stuff, and drove it into what was then called the jungle, the refugee camp in Calais. And then she's been working in refugee education for a number of years since then. And then last year she went on what she was calling a big sort of global adventure to go and visit alternative education providers all around the world. And she went with her daughter, who was about 7, I think, at the time. And their first stop was the Dominican Republic, where she went to visit a thing called a world school. And that then COVID hit and she got stuck there and set up a school, which is a really sort of like a learning to learn focused school. It's called The Hive. And I really recommend any listeners to have a look at what Kate's doing on her Instagram feed and her Twitter feed. It's absolutely incredible what she's doing there. So we had 5 lessons a week. They've literally got 100% of the curriculum time is learning to learn stuff. And it's absolutely phenomenal.
I mean, it's just incredibly inspiring, isn't it, to just set off and end up in another country, setting up a school, following your vision and seeing that through. It's absolutely incredible. So, I mean, I think in the UK, education has had a bit of a shift over the past few years, and we've seen a knowledge-rich curriculum come into play, maybe at the sort of detriment to learning to learn and things like that. How did you first why was learning to learn such an important thing for you? Why is it such a focus for you?
Yeah, you're right. Things have shifted. If this book had landed like 10 years ago, it might have been met with a much more fertile audience. As it was, it arrived in 2020 in November, when, in the middle of, COVID lockdowns and everything. It's not a good time to release a book that's about doing things fundamentally differently, really. But as you mentioned earlier, we started this journey a long time ago, and for us, the flame never went out. We could see the value in this, and also, there's a lot of hot air that's talked about learning to learn. People are very dismissive of it, and we go into quite a lot of detail, as you know, because you've read the book. Looking at that, why is it that, like the data on metacognition and self-regulation and oracy are really strong? And so is the sort of there are other arguments for why we should be helping young people to, become more confident, self-regulated, proactive learners who aren't just, learning how to pass tests, but they're learning how to take life by the scruff of the neck, it's obvious that we should be doing this stuff. And so for us, the flame never went out. But you're right, the policy agenda has shifted, certainly in England. I don't know what it's like in Italy, but certainly in England, we've shifted hard in the direction of very traditional pedagogical approaches, and learning to learn is not so much of a thing. So it's definitely a harder sell now than it would have been 10 years ago. But there's still a very receptive audience out there. And also, we had to get our house in order a bit. There was quite a lot of, part of the reason that everything's shifted towards knowledge rich is that there was quite a lot of flaky practice that was being carried out around the sort of, in the 2000s. And some of that went under the name of learning to learn. And, people associate it with things like learning styles and multiple intelligences and brain gym and all of that stuff that's now sort of, rightly consigned to the history bin. But we have a more forgiving analysis. Some people say, "Oh, this is outrageous," and we were lied to by the blob and all this stuff. And actually, I think of it more as just like a developmental phase that we had to go through. People were doing work around learning styles and brain gym in good faith. Like they thought that they were doing the right thing. It turns out that was a cul-de-sac, and we've regrouped and gone in different directions, and that's good. That's what learning looks like, right? We tell kids to learn from their mistakes all the time. We need to afford ourselves the same luxury.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm currently reading Guy Claxton's book, which is a fascinating read. It's a really good read. It's a bit pointy at points, but his fundamental argument is that, there are so many dichotomies in education, and we need to kind of break those dichotomies down. It is a knowledge rich or, the progressive slant and way of doing things. And I think what's really, really, what I found really insightful from reading your book is that one, this is a sustained research project that has been growing in scale and size. And two, you talked about previous iterations of different versions of learning to learn, and, why those potentially had failed, and what it was about your program fundamentally that was slightly different.
Yeah. So, we really came at this from first principles. We were not very aware of the history of learning to learn. I discovered that about 2 or 3 years later. Funnily enough, reading another publication of Claxton's, he wrote a thing called Learning to Learn, the Fourth Generation, that I didn't come across until about 2010. So we before I became a teacher, I used to work in medicine and healthcare, and there's this idea called a complex intervention, which is very widespread, very commonly understood in medicine and healthcare, and in other fields, in psychotherapy and social work and so on. And it's basically the idea that, that you don't want to be having an intervention that's only got one thing in it. There are no silver bullets. We need to have a complex intervention, which is made of many sort of different elements. And each of these things, are a good idea individually, but when you put them all together into a package, then those marginal gains sort of stack up and interact, and you get this bigger effect size overall. And so that was very central to my thinking right from the outset. I was like, we've got 5 lessons a week. What can we put into this complex intervention that is going to deliver, what these young people need? And we found that, we started with the young people. What were they good at and what were they not good at? And they were confident verbally in terms of, interacting verbally, but not in formal ways. They weren't really able to code switch. They weren't able to speak in different ways. They weren't very reflective. Their literacy skills were quite poor. This was a school in an area of high disadvantage. And so we started to put things in place to develop their oracy skills, first of all. And we also wanted them to find out what they could and could not do under their own steam, in the absence of adult supervision. And so we wanted to, not in the absence, but, with the adults stepping back at least. And so we wanted to do project-based learning, so that, because projects it's the most obvious way that you can take a step back. And I know that project-based learning is contentious, because if you want to, there was a study that the Education Endowment Foundation did recently, and it was like they were using project-based learning, but the outcome measures were reading and maths. And you just think, well, that's ridiculous. Like if you want the kids to learn reading and maths, then teach them to read and teach them maths. But if you want them to develop the skills of self-regulation, to be able to manage their own time and resources, to monitor a project, to develop the organizational skills and wherewithal, and to be able to exercise some choice, so agency is an important part here, then project-based learning is absolutely the vehicle to get you there. And so we gradually built up this complex intervention over 3 or 4 years, but it fundamentally boiled down to 3 key ideas. You mentioned metacognition earlier, so that was a big one, which we define as self-vision, which to my mind is about feelings and behaviors. It's like the mirror image of metacognition. It's about monitoring and controlling your feelings and your behaviors. So it actually goes quite deep into the person self-regulation. And then oracy was the third one, helping them to develop really confident speaking and listening skills in a range of contexts, whether that's in paired or small group talks, or taking part in structured debates, being able to deliver a knockout speech, doing philosophy for children, and so on. And all of that together, those 3 legs of the school stool together, if you like, metacognition, self-regulation, and oracy, combine to create what we define as self-regulated learners. So that was kind of, I don't know if that really answers your question, but that was kind of how we built it from the ground up, really. And it definitely draws on some ideas that have happened before, but it's got quite a few sprinkles of our own.
Yeah, no, I think first of all, it's absolutely paramount that this happens alongside the subject specific lessons that we know in the traditional sense. But I think that's one of the things that I took away from your book when I was thinking about what we were going to do at our school, and this idea of a complex intervention. And so what hasn't what's been inspired by your book is thinking about, well, how can we make sure that this is a complex intervention? So we are going to offer discrete lessons. We're going to embed this within our tutorial program, and then we're going to sort of work with teachers to really focus on core learning strategies. And I think that's probably, I'm going to ask you this, in terms of, was that one of the reasons why you think your program was so successful, that you were approaching it from a complex intervention standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because it allows you to sort of to break it down into component parts, and also to see how those component parts interact with one another. So yeah, I mean, is the short answer. And with regard to the other question, the thing about how it's important that this sits alongside subject-specific lessons, that's an interesting question. And to my mind, it's an open question. Because, like for 2 years, I worked at a place in Brighton called the Self-Managed Learning College. And it's literally self-managed. The young people are aged 9 to 18, and there's no lessons, there's no classrooms. The kids can literally self-manage their learning. They do what they want, when they want, for how long. And likewise, Kate, they've not got any like literacy lessons or numeracy lessons, and the kids are learning loads. And also home learning, like homeschoolers pretty consistently outperform kids in schools. So that's an open question whether we need subject-based learning. And I know that's quite out there. It's not something that people talk about a lot, especially in the age of knowledge rich. I'd probably be burned as a heretic for saying it. But I think that I want to go on record, Freya, on your show and say let's question that. If that's the case, why do homeschoolers do so well? Why do kids learn so effectively in self-directed learning communities?
I think that's a really good throwback and a question to me. And I think it is the extreme, isn't it? I think it's something that a lot of us, don't have much control over. It would be a higher educational kind of decision at a sort of government level, potentially. But a very, very interesting idea. For those of us that are slightly more constrained by subjects and by, the possibility of offering discrete lessons, how is that organized? How did you guys organize that?
How did we organize the discrete lessons?
Yeah.
Well, so we had the first thing to go in. I mentioned my master's before. My master's focused on philosophy for children, and I was really sold on that. And so that was the first thing to go in. So that was like 1 hour a week, done and dusted. The project-based learning took up 3 lessons a week usually. And so I could explain about some of the projects. So the first one, for example, in year 7 was a Who Am I project. So we literally just say, who are you? You got 6 weeks to answer that question in as many ways as you can. Off you go, sort of thing. And it's fascinating when you give kids a brief like that and then step back. It's really interesting to observe what happens next. So project-based learning, so some of them were individual projects like that. Some of them were group projects, like we built an allotment. One of them, we did a £2 challenge where we gave them each £2, and they had to, a bit like the parable of the talent, they had to make the money work by buying and selling stuff, or by, for example, buying a bucket and sponge and doing car wash, whatever. And then they had to agree democratically between them, like where they wanted to go on a school trip, and they had to fund it all. They organized the coach, they did the risk assessments, they wrote the letters to parents, they did all of it. So that was one. So project-based learning was the lion's share of the time. And then 1 lesson a fortnight, we would have a learning journal lesson where we would start the lesson with a like mindfulness meditation, or we started with guided visualizations just to chill the kids out and to get them into a sort of reflective mode of being, in that diffuse sort of mode of being where they can think about things in a different way. And then they would write. Most of that lesson was like silent writing in a learning journal, responding to prompt questions. And lots of the focus in those things was on transfer. So we would often ask them questions like, how are things going in maths? What's it like when maths goes really well? What's it like when maths is a shocker? How might what we've been doing in Learning to Learn help you learn more effectively in maths in future, say? So they're starting to make links between what they're doing and how they learn across the piece. And then the other 1 lesson a fortnight that alternated with that lesson would just be like an oracy focused lesson, where we were helping them to develop the ability to speak and listen. And that might focus on paired talk, or we did debates and so on. So that was basically it.
I mean, that's a really, really extensive program, isn't it? And tackling lots of different aspects of metacognition, self-regulation and oracy. Tell us a little bit more about the philosophy for children lessons and sessions that you did. That sounds really, really interesting.
Yeah, this is what have you had any experience with P4C yourself?
Very minimal.
Right. Okay. Funnily enough, I recently came across the guy who put me onto it. There's a guy called Marcelo Starikov who has written a book called The Joy of Not Knowing. Also a heretic. He can join me on the bonfire. I saw him do a talk. I was at a conference at Gatwick Airport, excitingly enough, and he was talking about P4C and just saying, honestly, you've got to see this thing in action. It's unbelievable. And I practically carved it into my pad that day. I wrote, you've got to get trained in this approach. And then, like with every conference, I sort of threw the pad in the corner of my office when I got back to school and just ignored it for a year or so. And then I found this pad ages later and I was like, oh, I totally forgot about that thing. I need to get trained up. So I got trained up in it. And basically, if people haven't heard of it, it's an approach that was developed by a professor, a philosophy professor in the States called Matthew Lippman in the 60s. And in the 60s, as you know, there was, this big period of student unrest all over the world, 68 and all that, the Soixante-Huiters and all that. And he was finding that he was having to negotiate between faculty and between students to try to figure stuff out. And he was just amazed at how unable these philosophy students were to take part in a reasoned discussion. They were studying the art of reasoning and argumentation and so on, and they weren't able to do it themselves. They could tell you what Descartes thought, but they couldn't actually think their way out of a paper bag. So he put this program together to start much earlier. And he initially wrote a series of books, which were sort of like stories that would, like contain philosophical ideas, and they were just like stimuli for discussions. And then he developed a pedagogy that went along with it, where usually you sit in a circle, the teacher as well, on the floor or on chairs, and you come up with a question. So you share some sort of a stimulus. It might be a Lippmann book, or it might, you can do it with anything, with a poem, a piece of art, a piece of music, a lit candle, whatever it might be. And you do a little bit of training with the kids on how to generate good questions, like philosophical questions that lend themselves to extended discussion. Then the kids come up with a question. There's the official way of doing it. The way that you're trained to do it is this very lengthy way that I'm describing now. So you come up with the question, you share the questions, you vote on them, you decide on one, and by this time, like half the lesson's over, and then you have an extended discussion of that one question. I used to prefer to just cut straight to the discussion bit, and so I started using either getting the kids to ask their own questions, and often they've got questions in their heads. You don't need to go through this lengthy process. And then, you just have an open-ended discussion. And it's really interesting because like some of the kids who are good at school, the ones who, double underline the date and they hand their homework in and they get good marks, like there's no right answer in philosophy. If you ask them a question, like if you paint over a window, is it still a window? Or, is there more future or more past? They don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. It's like, it's up for discussion. Let's think it through together. And so some of them would really find that very challenging because they don't know how to win at that game, but it's absolutely fascinating. It takes a little while to get the hang of it because you're not a teacher. Your job isn't to teach knowledge in that form. And I used to fall into that hole time and time again. You have to take a step back and be a facilitator of these conversations. And sometimes it's okay to let a misconception go by unchallenged because they're not there to have. It's not a science lesson, say, if they make a misconception about space or parallel universes. That's not the time to address that question. So you just have to sort of let some things go because they're learning to listen to one another, to build on each other's ideas, to give reasons for their thinking. So it's a very metacognitive process because they become, as well as taking part in the discussion, they are observing the discussion and they're noticing the shape that it takes. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I strongly recommend that everybody listening gets trained in it and has a go in it because you can apply it in any lesson. You can do history A-level with P4C. You can do revision lessons with it. You can do, it really lends itself to things like PSHE, or I don't know if there's the equivalent of that in Italy, like personal social health type stuff. Anything with a moral dimension is good for those extended discussions. But yeah, it's a wonderful thing.
It's such a critical thing, isn't it, to develop pupils' oracy and their ability to think critically. And it is something that I think they will really carry through their entire life.
Yeah, absolutely. And the flip side of that is that if they don't, learn how to engage in those extended discussions and how to talk for talk's sake, how to just,
have an opinion.
Yeah, exactly. How to have an opinion, how to change your mind without climbing down too much. Kids really struggle with that. How to disagree with somebody without offending them. That's an interesting one because often, and the kids really struggle with that at first. They say things like, "Oh, that's stupid because," and you're like, "Hang on, you can't start a sentence with that because you're just like, disempowering the other person. Can you think of another way to phrase that?" And they can, they say things like "no offense, but," and then they just go on to say something offensive. But they get the hang of it after a while, and they start to say things like, "Oh, I can see why you would say that, but have you thought about this?" And so they get better at it, and that's really important. My goodness, if you just take a look at the news, we need to learn how to stop talking past one another as a species, and learn how to really listen and engage and understand other people's perspectives. So there's a strong moral dimension to this work. It's not just about, making kids more effective learners so that their grades go up, although it does do that. This is about, helping young people to learn how to get along with one another in the way that I've just been talking about. But also, I think that probably the most important thing is confidence. Like when you do that work around oracy, you can almost see them growing an inch taller. Like it changes their perception of themselves and what they can go on to achieve in the future. And it's just magic. Like that's what I certainly got into teaching for. And so it's important work, this, I think.
I completely agree with you. And I've said previously on another show that for me, having worked both in state and in private, one of the kind of discernible differences between those students is their confidence in articulating their opinion and their thoughts and their ideas and having those discussions. It's such an important skill for them to learn. And like you say, it is transferable in all subjects. It's something that can be applied to all subjects, and transference is quite a key important aspect of metacognition and developing that. You've talked about project-based learning, which I think is really, really interesting and really, really exciting. I am really interested in the sort of reflective journal. What did that actually look like? What were some of the questions that you would ask pupils to kind of reflect upon?
Yeah, I mean, it really changed, and our practice evolved a lot. So, like in the first year, they sort of had scrapbooks where they could just like store like evidence of what it was that they'd been doing and so on. But that didn't really work very well. We were trying to use it as an assessment tool, and it just really didn't work. And so it sort of evolved over time. And so it ended up with it being sort of, there'd be a series of prompt questions on the board. So we tried to keep it fresh and to sort of change the format a little bit, at least each time. We would give them, we would sort of differentiate it. If there were kids who were really struggling to write, say, then some of them would have writing frames. But essentially, it was asking them about, it was a metacognitive exercise, right? So it was about trying to help them to pay attention to how they think about things and how they learn in different contexts. So when I mentioned earlier about metacognition and self-regulation, they both are really about two processes: monitoring and control. So first of all, you encourage the young people to notice what's happening. So that you say things like, how does it feel when you see that you've got maths next, say, on your timetable? Do you have a response to that? Like, do you think, brilliant, I love maths? Or do you think, oh man, I had rubbish at maths, I'm never going to be any good at maths? What do you notice about your thoughts? And then you can sort of put some distance between them, and you can sort of talk about how, maybe that's just a script that's going around your head. Maybe you can change the script, and that's when you find where the controls are, where the levers are, if you like. So we would often ask questions like that, so like, what's it like when you learn something really effectively in maths? And for example, things like, what were you actually doing when you learned such and such a thing this week? Think about a lesson where you learned something. What were you actually doing in the moment that the penny dropped, or the moment that you realized that you had learned a thing? What had you actually done? Was it when you asked a question? Did you read it? Did you overhear it? Did it just sort of soak in, and you're not really sure how you learned it? So we're trying to shine a light on the processes of learning, because some kids are really good, they just get everything. Sometimes they're quite quiet, they sit there at the back of the class, and my mum was a teacher, she used to say that they've got sticky antennae. Things just stick, and they internally sort of gobble them up, and they just learn stuff really effectively. But those kids are doing something. Like, they're not just sitting there passively. It's not like they just listen, the words go in their ears, and then they're in their brain. They're doing something with them. That whole idea about memory being the residue of thought, like, they're chewing it over. They've got some process, some cognitive process for processing that information. And so doing things, using practices like think alouds and doing things like learning journals, it just like encourages the kids to articulate what's going on in their minds. And then they swap notes and they exchange notes, and they're like, oh, so-and-so learns in this way. So-and-so makes up little songs in their head. So-and-so uses images, and they make mental pictures in their mind. So-and-so, uses rhymes or whatever it is. And so they learn from one another, and therefore the ability to learn stuff becomes much more tangible and therefore more learnable.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I mean, we've spoken so far about learning to learn programs if we don't have the luxury of turning the curriculum on its head. And you've spoken about how within your research and your work with Kate, you organised a complex intervention that was run on sort of 3 levels: philosophy for children, project-based learning, and the sort of reflective learning space. You were obviously afforded a massive luxury by a wonderfully supported head teacher there. What advice would you give to people who are really seeing the importance of this and it is incredibly important that we're having conversations with pupils about learning. We aren't exam factories. We need to really support pupils become independent, lifelong learners. And I think this is absolutely critical to that. What advice would you give to people who maybe don't have as much luxury as you? Where would you start if you just have a little bit of freedom to be doing some of this work?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really, really good question. You absolutely don't need to start with, you know, a massive chunk of curriculum time and think, if that doesn't apply here, then this doesn't apply to me. There are loads of things you can do. So, I mean, I don't want to say buy the book, right? But like in the book,
it's a great book.
Thank you. The biggest chapter by far is chapter 5, which is called Components of a Complex Intervention. And it contains loads of ideas about like drilling down through these broad categories of metacognition, self-regulation, and oracy, drilling down to figure out, you know, like what, for example, with regard to oracy. So I would start with your young people. Like, what is it that you think that they most need? You know, is it to develop their oracy skills, say? And so one thing that you can do is, if you visit the Thinking Together website, the University of Cambridge Thinking Together website, there are loads of resources on there freely available for people who want to know how to get the kids to engage in what we refer to as exploratory talk. Because that's probably like the most it's the most transformational thing that I ever did as a teacher, I think, was to introduce the most simple technique to use ground rules to structure group talk. Because group work gets a bad reputation. You can see why, because you know, when young people aren't taught how to interact effectively in groups, then they struggle to do so, and group work can go pear-shaped quite quickly. But when you teach them how to interact effectively in groups, using a simple set of group ground rules, or discussion guidelines, they're sometimes called, then, you know, it just transforms the quality of conversation and of learning that happens overnight. So I really recommend doing that. Learning journals, people really like, and it's a very, you know, it's a very easy thing to do. It's cheap, you know. You can just give them a book each, and you can use it for homework. You can use it for a reflection task. A weekly review is a really good idea, and this could just be like 5 minutes at the start of each week. You just have 5 minutes, and again, so if you think about monitoring and control, so you think like, let's look back at last week first of all. We're not doing retrieval practice here. We're just thinking about last week. What happened last week? What went well last week? What did you find difficult? What was surprising? What do you still not understand, and so on. And then you look ahead to the week ahead. So it's this sort of Janus-faced process, if you like. Looking back is the monitoring bit, and then looking forward, you're saying, so here's what we're going to be doing this week. You know, what problems can you anticipate in advance? What can we do together or individually to overcome those problems before we encounter them? What strategies might you try? You know, what would you do differently if you lived last week again, say? So you're just building in the habit of reflection bit by bit, and like, you know, 5 minutes a week is like, anybody can do that as a starter activity, and you don't have to write it down. It can just be a discussion thing. You can just ask the kids to discuss it in pairs. Hugely powerful thing to do. And there's many more besides. Last week I did a webinar. If people want more, I did a free webinar which is available online. I could send you a link. I don't know if you have show notes or anything, do you?
Yeah, no, I can put the link up on the show.
Okay, great. So I'll do that. I'll say, so it's a 90-minute webinar, which is like an overview of self-regulated learning. It's the first in a series of 4 that I'm doing this year. The next 3 will be on those 3 concepts that we talked about earlier. This one was a general overview of self-regulated learning, but that's got 8 sort of like easy ideas in it for how to get started on this journey. So yeah, absolutely. There's loads of stuff that you can do whatever your circumstances.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to thank you because after reading your book and doing some research into the IB approaches to learning as well, we've managed to create a learning to learn program, which we are, as I said earlier, tackling through tutor time, discrete lessons, and within subjects as well. And it's just been so interesting to put together, and there's a lot of work that needs to happen. But you're right, it can start with the smallest of actions, and this year I started at the beginning of the year to do that kind of reflective journal at the end of every week with my tutor group, and just sort of say to them what has been really successful for you this week. What have you struggled with? Why have you struggled with it? And then how could you approach that perhaps differently in future? And those little moments, those conversations are all sort of starting to tap away at that notion, isn't it, really?
Yeah, great. Well, it's wonderful to hear. So you're in an international school and you teach in the IB?
Yeah, international school teaching the IB. We are rolling out our Learning to Learn program from next year, which is super exciting. So I want to just hear from you in terms of, after conducting this research, after the 8 years of trialing this and refining this program that you put together with Kate, you had incredible success with it, didn't you?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yes. Those kids went on to achieve the best set of results that school had seen by some margin. And the gap closed from the bottom up. So it was especially beneficial for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, which is wonderful. And we're very circumspect about this. It's only one school, and it was a school that was in a particular, quite particular set of circumstances. And so the question remains as to whether this thing is scalable. But I really think that it is. And a lot of the work that I've done more recently has been around implementation science. And that's this new field of study that's emerged in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, really. And it's very there's basically only me who's banging this drum. There's also, the Education Endowment Foundation have published some guidance on implementation, but it takes a slightly different route to the version that I promote. But I've been running this training with schools for the last couple of years, and it's incredible. Like the response that it receives and the results that it achieves. We know now how to scale up. Not just learning to learn, but anything really effectively. And so I feel quite confident that we can do this. But I really want to, just to build a network of schools so that people are talking to each other. So there's a mighty network which has grown up. I've also got a podcast. Sorry to do a plug. I've got a podcast called Rethinking Education, and alongside that, there's this mighty network, this online community of people who are interested in these ideas. Because it's really important that people can see one another. Like, until today, I didn't know that you were doing this work in Italy, and this stuff might be happening all over the world, but everyone's sort of doing it in silos, and it's so much easier for it to sort of fall apart again unless we can all be like united in numbers. So it's really important that we're able to see one another. So I look forward to hearing more from you about how things are going. Whereabouts in Italy are you?
I'm in Rome. So I'm at St. George's British International School in Rome. And so, yeah, we've literally just drafted our first Learning to Learn program that we're going to start from September, and, massively inspired by the work that you and Kate have done. And I really, at the end of the book, there is this call to arms from you both about, how you would like to see whether it is a scalable thing. And I just think that that's an incredibly interesting thing. And the research that you and Kate have done and the success that you've had really sort of persuaded me that this was vitally important to try and organize within our school. So I'm really, really excited. We've got a lot of work to do, and I'm sure there'll be lots of bumps along the way, but we do have a Learning to Learn program ready to sort of go tagged into the IB approaches to learning, which is very, very exciting. So the approaches to learning for the IB are things like self-management, communication, research, thinking, etc., etc., etc. And our whole school focus next year is on oracy. So it's all coming together beautifully.
Amazing.
Yeah, which is very, very exciting. It has been absolutely amazing to talk to you, and I really, really hope that this conversation can continue. So we can network, not just me, I'm not just talking about me here, but if you're interested in building a Learning to Learn program, we can network through was it the podcast you said?
Yeah, so there's a thing called the Mighty Network, which is it's a bit like a Facebook type platform where there's all kinds of different special interest groups on there. So if you search up the Rethinking Education Mighty Network, there's also an app. You can get it on your phone. So if you just download the Mighty Networks app and look for Rethinking Education, and check out the podcast as well. I did a really interesting. We've had this offshoot of the podcast. We've started this thing called Campfire Conversations, which is more sort of spontaneous live conversations. And we did one on Saturday with 9 young people aged 9 to 18, and that's absolutely fascinating and actually quite a moving conversation. With them talking about their experience of school and how they just felt, God. At one point, this one boy talks about how he felt like the class. He equates the classroom to a recycling bin. And he's like, if you don't learn in the way that they want you to learn, then they sort of toss you aside like a piece of trash. It was just so heartbreaking to hear, this range of kids from a very different range of backgrounds talking about their really quite, bad experiences of mainstream schools. And I'm really keen to bring more and more young people's voices into this conversation because it's so often missing. I think we're both probably very plugged into the very thriving online community of teachers talking to other teachers and reading one another's books and so on. But I don't see that much example where young people's voices are brought into that conversation. And I think that we need to do that because, there's some worrying data around the increase in, self-harm and, mental health disorders among young people. And, we're not getting it right currently. And so that's also got a strong moral dimension to it. So anyway, I'm rambling. Thank you so much for
No, I watched that Campfire Conversation and it was incredibly moving. Yeah, it was incredibly moving. And it just reinforces the need to build a lot more of this into what we do. Honestly, thank you so much. You've inspired the work that we're putting in, and I can't wait to see where that goes. So thank you, James.
I look forward to hearing from you down the line. Thanks, Freya.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.
Right, we're going to go to the news, and then I am going to be joined by the incredible, amazing Zoe Enza. Cannot wait for that one.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Megan Goods.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News. It has been 33 years since the introduction of Section 28 into British law. The discriminatory law came into effect on the 24th of May 1988 and made it illegal for teachers and local councils to educate students about the LGBT community. Section 28 was introduced by Margaret Thatcher following a conference speech in 1987 where she stated, "Children that need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. And all of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life." The amendment was still in place less than 20 years ago, only being revoked in England and Wales in 2003. Academics from Exeter University and the London School of Economics have found that during lockdown, 91% of children aged 9 to 16 had access to a computer, and 90% had good internet connection. However, only 74% of students had a quiet place to study. Parents involved in the study stated that the lack of a suitable place to work was more of a barrier to learning during the time away from school than issues with access to technology. BBC Radio 4 and Teaching Union NASUWT have joined forces to compile a survey on teachers' confidence levels when dealing with incidents of sexual assault. More than half of teachers questioned felt their schools did not have the resources to deal with such incidents. Almost a third of those surveyed also said they had witnessed peer-on-peer sexual harassment or abuse, and almost 1 in 10 said they saw it on a weekly basis. The study concluded that better training and support was needed for staff dealing with the steadily rising number of sexual assault cases in schools. That was your daily education news briefing.
Introducing Amanda Davey. Amanda is one of the first specialist teacher assessors for dyscalculia in the UK and offers dyscalculia tutoring and bespoke training for schools. With 26 years of teaching and tutoring experience in the UK, Amanda offers specialist online tuition focused on building confidence and developing skills. Amanda also offers online and face-to-face training on dyscalculia for educators, informing practitioners as to how to identify children that may have dyscalculia and how to support them in class. Find out more about Amanda and what she can offer you at www.amanda-davey-dyscalculia.co.uk.
So my next guest needs no introduction at all. Mrs. Zoe Enzer. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that I am a bit of a fangirl of the Enzers. I absolutely love them. They are fantastic on Twitter. They are straight talking, no nonsense, incredibly experienced, so well researched. I absolutely love listening to them at webinars and at conferences, and I'm so delighted to have Zoe with me today. Zoe was a classroom English teacher for over 20 years, as well as head of department and a school leader in charge of improving teaching and learning, and she is now lead English specialist advisor for Kent with the Education People. Good evening, Zoe.
Hello, Freya. How lovely to speak to you again. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, do you know, it's like the pleasure is absolutely mine. I absolutely adore you guys. We're going to talk about generative learning because we're talking about learning strategies, supporting pupils with their learning. What I really, really loved about this book is that it was such a natural follow-on to Rosenshine's. So Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction by Tom Sherrington came out, and it was very, very focused, wasn't it, on teachers and what teachers were doing in the classroom. And this book, Generative Learning, really sort of turned that on the head a little bit. And although it complements Rosenshine really, really well, it was much more focused on the students and what the students are doing in the classroom.
Absolutely. And I kind of coined the phrase, the flip side of Rosenshine, because there'd been so much focus on what teachers were doing. Generative learning seemed to offer this opportunity to really reconsider what that meant for the students. So once we were, again, to borrow something from Tom Sherrington, to kind of hand that baton over from the teacher and the instruction and all of the good things they were doing to actually think about what was going on with the students during those processes. So, for me, it just seemed to be that obvious connection between the two things.
Absolutely. It was such a beautiful follow-on. So for anyone who hasn't really read the book, what is generative learning?
To borrow Logan Fiorella, who did the original research or the kind of analysis of the variety of research out there with Richard Mayer, he talks about it being literally how we create meaning. So generative learning and generative learning strategies are how we take that information that we are given and often bombarded by in a classroom and create something deeper and build that into our long-term memories and into our schemas. So it literally is generating that kind of meaning and understanding that we want students to have. And there are 8 strategies which the research indicated were the strongest strategies, and they include summarising, mapping, drawing, enacting, imagining, I know I'm going to forget some here because I always do, teaching, self-explaining and self-testing. And they're the ones that came out strongest as the ways that students can really develop that deeper understanding and embed those things into the schemas.
And there is in the book a chapter on each of those strategies. And what I really love about the book, again, is the sort of there's an analysis of the strategy in action, and then you have the case studies as well where teachers are embedding these strategies within the classroom. It's such a fantastic read.
And one of which you very kindly gave us the case study.
I wasn't going to plug myself there, but such an honour to be able to contribute to the book. Why do you think this is important? Why do you think it's important to look at these strategies and really sort of think about embedding these strategies within the classroom?
I think it's important because, again, to kind of come back to that point, a lot of our focus is on changing the processes that teachers go through and changing their methods of delivery. And actually, the area we have least control over is what happens within a student's mind. And what this starts to do is to make some of those processes more visible to the teachers, so we can see what learning is happening and have a greater chance of understanding what it is that students have understood and what they've retained. But then perhaps even more importantly, and this maybe links to some of the things that James was talking about earlier when he was talking to you, is students understanding those processes. So it's that kind of natural step towards empowering students to take more control over their own learning and to have that greater understanding of what the processes they've gone through and what's actually happening in their minds when they're thinking about these things.
So as you said, there's 8 different strategies: summarising, mapping, drawing, imagining, self-testing, self-explaining, teaching and enacting. I don't suppose you could give us this sort of very brief summary with regard to each of those?
To each of those. Well, I guess the principles across all of them are the same in that it relies on the SOI model, which Richard Mayer developed in terms of how we kind of select and organise and integrate information into our long-term memories. So each of the principles is underlined by that. With summary, it is literally what it says. It's taking that information, that longer piece of information that's been presented to us either via a text or a presentation or a video, and then how they select the most important points, organise that into a new way of understanding it, and then again integrate that with their own prior knowledge. With something like enacting, that's very much focused on the use of gestures and how those gestures can accompany different things. But again, it relies on this idea of them selecting the most appropriate pieces of information from the learning and the kind of materials that are being presented to them, and how they're then reorganising them in a way that they're going to be able to embed them in that long-term memory. I think probably my favourite strategy and the strategy that people are most familiar with would be related to that self-testing, and there's some strong links there to things like retrieval and recap. And students, again, being very aware when they're going through those self-testing processes about what it is that they perhaps need to focus their next steps on, what it is that's already well embedded, and again having that greater understanding.
I was going to ask you actually, which is your favourite strategy? I mean, I think the self-testing one is probably one that most people are familiar with now because of the work of retrieval practice across education. I really like teaching. I know I wrote the case study there, but I really like teaching. This idea that pupils, are given material that they have to work with and then present to other pupils and making sure that they really know that material and sort of interrogate that material. I've always found that works really, really well. And Hattie is, said, for example, the jigsaw method that I talk about in the chapter has such a positive effect size as well.
It's a really interesting one, and as you unpick it, again, it's thinking about the different layers and the processes that students go through. So one of the things that came up in the research there was around whether the impact from that came from thinking they were going to present it to someone else, so therefore they were going to study that material in a different way, or whether it was having that opportunity to present it and then having their ideas interrogated. So again, I think that comes back to some of the areas that James was exploring there, with sort of students sitting together and discussing their ideas and exploring their way of seeing the world. And to actually isolate that in teaching is quite difficult, but it does seem to have a positive effect size. And then not just in terms of those outcomes of direct learning, but then maybe in the outcomes in other ways. When we're thinking about oracy, when we're thinking about building confidence and resilience and being able to present those ideas in that way.
Absolutely. And I think the teaching one for me is really, really key with regard to sort of metacognition. And this, I'm really fascinated at the moment by self-explanation. It's kind of linked, isn't it, in some ways, because you're trying to explain these processes and concepts to someone else and teach them to them.
Absolutely. And I think that's something I do a lot as a learner myself. I will run through things in my head a lot. I will explain things and re-explain things to myself and shed bits of information which I don't think are particularly useful, and then return to them. And it's just this kind of continuous process that a lot of learners will go through, but we're not necessarily always aware of that. The difficulty with that self-explaining, if you haven't got that awareness, is, of course, not having something visible, whereas with a summary or with self-testing or with teaching, you've got that very visible outcome that you can use. Equally with drawing or mapping, you've got something that's physically there and you can talk about those processes, whereas with self-explaining it, with it being so internal, that can be perhaps more difficult for some people to be able to manage.
Yeah, I think that's probably why actually I find it really, really fascinating. And I was on a metacognition course today, and they were talking about how frequently actually teachers are really, really good at modeling processes and doing that self-explaining, but actually we don't give students the opportunity to do that enough. And maybe it is because we don't always have that tangible outcome that we can measure.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And I think, in some lessons we might give them those pause points to reflect and to consider what they've just learned and to think about that. But it is quite worrying, isn't it? Because as you say, that we can't see, what's going on. They could well be thinking about what they're doing after school or next lesson, and we can't guarantee that process is happening. But again, I think the power can come in when students understand why we're asking them to do that at that particular time. And they understand how it relates to their learning, and they're much more likely then to engage with that process themselves.
Lovely. Something that I'm really thinking about at the moment is probably linked to your new book. I hear you have a new book coming out.
We do indeed, the CPD curriculum, Creating the Conditions for Growth. Thank you for the plug.
Just getting that one in there. I'm really interested in thinking about how we actually support pupils in developing these strategies. So we've got 8 strategies that we know from research are said to have the most significant impact for students in terms of their learning. We're not going to introduce all 8 strategies at once. How would you approach utilizing the research here as a classroom teacher or as a school or as a department?
Well, firstly, I'd think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. So, what question might you be answering for your students? What are you picturing the outcome would be? And that will help you to then select which of these tools you want to utilise. Then it's making sure that the teachers have a really good understanding of what that means and what that looks like. If I was to give you the example of summary, that was something that I would say I started doing on perhaps day one of my teaching career. I would ask students to write a summary of something that we'd read or something that we've been talking about. What I didn't always fully understand was why I was asking them to do that. And there can be different reasons why I would do that. But if it was for a generative purpose, and if I was focusing on kind of that selection, organisation and integration process, then I really need to understand that myself so that I can explain to students what that means and then I can model for them what that looks like. So as with any new strategy that a school or a teacher was hoping to introduce, making sure you've got that real understanding of it, that you're selecting it for the right reasons, and you've got that right purpose for what you're doing, and then again taking the students through the process to make sure it's working well. One of the limitations with summary, when you look at the research, is the fact that in order to do that really effectively as a generative strategy, you need to really invest in teachers being trained to be able to do that well themselves, because perhaps we assume sometimes that we understand how a summary works and we can all do that very well. But if we want the most effective version of that, we've got to really understand it and be trained in it.
I think that's a really interesting point. And again, something that came out today on the course that I was on, in terms of when we're thinking about metacognition, or when we're thinking about these strategies to generate learning, how often is it that we've actually gone through the process ourselves and really understand the steps necessary to make the process as successful as it can be?
And we have that difficulty as well, because I'm sure that if I were to say to any teacher, can you just summarise what we've talked about or summarise what we've done, they would be able to do that. What's more difficult is to be able to go through those steps one by one and think, well, how did I do that? How did I go from hearing that information to writing that summary? And that can be quite difficult to unpick when you're already quite proficient in doing that.
Yeah, that was something that the course instructor was saying today, that actually we take for granted, don't we, how we are experts in a lot of these different areas that, like you say, if someone asks us to summarize something, we can do it very, very quickly because we've probably done it a number of times before. But actually thinking about the steps in order to support pupils with that, it is something that actually we probably need to dedicate a lot more time to, and probably needs to be much more of a focus in terms of our CPD.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm pretty confident when, I say that probably on day one of my first ever English lesson, I may well have asked students to summarise. I probably did make that assumption that they could just do it. And that may well have resulted in some quite poor examples of summaries coming out of the process, which wouldn't have been particularly helpful to them.
Absolutely. Now, the one strategy that I always struggle with is drawing.
Me too. You've probably got the wrong person on the call here.
What advice would you give to people with regard to the drawing strategy? I mean, maybe that's a Mark question for another time, but I really...
I guess because I find it quite difficult myself, it probably does make it an interesting area to explore, because I'm not a particularly proficient drawer. I can do something that's a bit of a facsimile of a tree if I'm drawing it on the board for the students or whatever, but actually it doesn't matter about the technical accuracy, and this is the thing with generative learning strategies. It's about those processes that they go through, and what students can get very tangled up in is the fact that they want to produce something that looks like a perfect tree, as opposed to thinking about, well, what am I having to select and organise? And so getting students to bypass that's really important, because otherwise what you're in danger of is that students will remember a lesson where they drew a tree but won't remember that the reason they drew a tree was because they were trying to identify different aspects of plant life and growth, or whatever it was that you were trying to teach them. So again, that comes down to modelling and teacher explanation. So showing them that that's okay, showing them that, you're not having to create this wonderful piece of artwork unless you're in art, and making them realise that. But, certainly I've used drawing as a strategy, again, in the English classroom, where we've been thinking about something like the opening of Mice and Men, which we know is a very visceral opening with lots of wonderful things to visualise. And getting students to think about how they translate and to be able to put some of those onto the page can be an important way to, again, integrate this setting that Steinbeck is creating. But it doesn't matter that it might not look exactly like the mountain that they had in their mind. It might not look exactly like the kind of the deer prints and things that are around on the sandy bank. So again, as I say, it's teacher modelling, teacher explanation to show them that it's a process we're going through and we're not trying to be Rembrandt or something.
Yeah, that's really, really important, isn't it? To make sure that the focus is always on actually the learning process. And I think what's really, really interesting as well, and something that we really need to sort of develop, is this idea of what we're doing is we're providing them with a range of strategies across a period of time. And as you say before, it's really about choosing the strategy that works. It is really vital, though, isn't it, that they have a range of strategies at their disposition, especially as they head towards those later years.
Absolutely. And I think there's a real power in them taking these forward for their own independent learning. And I think about my own transition when I was leaving kind of compulsory education and then going into, a little bit later when I studied for my A-levels and went on to do my degree, actually understanding what I needed to have in terms of the tools available to me was quite limited because that hadn't been modelled for me and it hadn't been shown to me. And then if you look at the work of Dunlosky and the toolkit that he puts together for things like student revision, there's a lot of overlap with some of these strategies and certainly things like self-testing, summary, which he's perhaps more reticent about. But that can be really powerful in letting students understand how they're going to learn more and become lifelong learners.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm really, really focused in at the moment, especially with, the Learning to Learn program, but then also these generative learning strategies, is that I want pupils, when they get to GCSE, when they get to IB or A levels, to have this repertoire of strategies that they know they can draw upon when they are preparing for their I want to say for their examinations, but then for any future learning that they go through later on in life.
Absolutely, because they need to understand that it doesn't end there, and they'll be returning to those strategies when they're in the workplace. It doesn't just have to be about those examinations, but the only way they'll be able to really understand those is if we can embed those different approaches within our classroom and support them and scaffold them to the point where they can use them independently.
Definitely. And I was just thinking, what kind of strategies do I use? I think probably I use a lot of summarizing and a lot of self-testing.
Yeah, and I think that does tend to be, from an English classroom point of view, it does quite a staple, doesn't it? But that's why I thought it was interesting when we asked Adam Ritchie's to do the case study on using Cornell notes. And that actually combines a few of those different strategies if they're used really well, because you've got the element where you're going to show students how to note take, and they will understand that process and that part of the process. There is then the section that's usually at the bottom of the page where they summarise, and they can either do that from memory or they can do that selecting pieces there. And then down the side, you've got the key points or questions, and they can use that as self-testing. So I like the way that particular approach, if used in that way, can draw on those different areas of generative learning.
I absolutely want to develop my mapping. I just think that that's such a crucial one for approaching essays later on, at GCSE and IB, using different forms of mapping to map ideas that would then go into an academic piece of writing.
I think the work of Oliver Calviglioli is going to be really. He's got a new book coming out in relation to that, and they've broken it down, because obviously we look at there's kind of the mapping as a main concept, and then kind of graphic organisers where you're giving some more scaffold and structures to students to do that, and you're giving them those key points. But he really unpicks all the different approaches to that. And again, it's about making the schemas, the processes, the way we organise our own understanding of these different topics in a very visual way. And Oliver's had quite a lot of success with that.
He really has, and I always feel really intimidated when I'm reading his. I've got his first book, and when I was looking at all the different graphic organizers, I felt quite intimidated by it. I suppose because it's quite linked to drawing as well. The English teacher in me finds that quite difficult to get to grips with. But I just think that it would be so beneficial for pupils to then again have an array of different maps and graphic organizers to draw upon when they're planning responses or thinking about, the essays that they need to write and the structures there.
But I think that again comes back to how we embed them in our lessons, how you're using them. And we know that there's a real power, actually, if you're finding it difficult, there'll be a real power for students to see that you're finding going through those processes quite difficult. You might understand what you're doing, but it's okay if you make mistakes. It's okay if you decide that you're going to have to make a change there. And that will, again, support them in thinking about how they can take these forward too.
Definitely. We're all learners, right? We're all learning all of the time.
Definitely.
Just very quickly, because we're coming to the end of the show, just tell us a little bit about your new book as it comes out.
Well, as it says on the tin, it's the CPD curriculum. And as somebody who led CPD across my last school that I was in, and I work quite closely currently with schools in developing their own CPD for departments and for the school as a whole. It was really reflecting on some of our experiences of CPD and thinking about the lessons that we've learned from developing curriculum for students and how we could translate those things across. So within the book, we've thought about the overall curriculum and how we might develop that in order to have a whole school approach or a whole department approach. But also for individuals to think about how they might develop their own particular learning program, and then within it how we can utilize the different elements of implementation. And again, that was something that I thought was interesting James mentioned, because how do we take it from that kind of big idea of what we want people to learn, the curriculum that overarches everything, into the what's happening in the classroom, and supporting teacher learning through that, and again utilising the things that we know about student learning to empower teachers to be able to use those things themselves and to bring them to adult learning processes too. And actually we've got a section within there about teacher metacognition, as I think, not only thinking about how we transfer that to students, but how we are being metacognitive about our own learning too.
Love it. I'm so excited. I can't wait. I have it on pre-order already, so I can't wait for that to arrive. Thank you so much for joining me, Zoe.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure.
It's an absolutely fantastic book. If you have not read Generative Learning in Action, I can wholeheartedly recommend it. It is very, very exciting. I was very excited when it came out because we saw that shift fundamentally from teacher instruction to actually encouraging the students to start to take control of their learning and develop that. Thank you, Zoe, for joining me. It's always lovely to talk to you. I hope you have a lovely rest of the evening. That is it for this week. We are out of time. It has been fantastic talking to James and Zoe this evening. James, the learning to learn, the complex intervention, the philosophy for kids, the project-based learning, the reflective journals, this idea of metacognition and self-regulation, and then Zoe about our generative learning strategies, where we're really thinking about selecting, organizing, and integrating information through those 8 different strategies of summarizing, mapping, drawing, imagining, self-testing, self-explaining, teaching, and enacting. Of course, this is not the end. It would be great to keep up the discussion on Twitter. Next week, I'm going to be talking about how we support experienced teachers in the classroom. I am going to be joined by David Weston, amongst others. So I'm really, really excited to talk to David Weston next week about how we can continue to support experienced teachers in the classroom and keep their passion alive without going up the leadership scale necessarily. Thank you for joining me this evening. Have a lovely week. I will see you next week. And I look forward to our discussion with David Weston.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.